2 days before saying "I do," David Mitchell made a decision that would shatter everything he thought he knew about love. He faked his own collapse, staged a medical emergency, and watched from the shadows as his fiancée faced what she believed were his final hours. But what he discovered in that hospital room wasn't betrayal. It was something far more devastating, a truth so profound it would force him to question whether some tests should never be run, whether some doubts should never be indulged, and whether trust, once broken, can ever truly be rebuilt. This is the story of a man who got exactly what he asked for and lost everything he never knew he had. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My mom said I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. David Mitchell was 38 years old when he decided to test the woman he claimed to love. A logistics coordinator for a mid-sized shipping company in Portland, Oregon, David had built his life on predictability and control. His apartment was organized with military precision. His spreadsheets at work were color-coded and flawless. His 5-year plan included marriage, children, and a house in the suburbs, all checked off like items on a grocery list. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior was a man haunted by a single devastating memory from 7 years earlier, the day he discovered his ex-fiancée in bed with his best friend, 3 weeks before their scheduled wedding. That betrayal had carved something out of him, left a hollow space where trust used to live. And now, with his wedding to Emma Chen just 48 hours away, that hollow space had begun to echo with doubt. Emma was everything David thought he wanted. At 35, she taught English at a local middle school, the kind of teacher students remembered decades later. She was patient, thoughtful, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to see the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. They'd met 2 years earlier at a community book club, bonding over their shared love of mystery novels and terrible coffee. The relationship had progressed logically, naturally, checking all of David's mental boxes. She was stable, kind, employed, and seemingly devoted. But in the weeks leading up to the wedding, David had noticed small things that his traumatized mind had twisted into evidence of deception. Emma had started taking phone calls in another room. She'd been distracted during conversations, her mind clearly elsewhere. Twice, he'd caught her quickly closing her laptop when he entered the room. And 3 days before the wedding, he'd overheard her on the phone saying something that had frozen his blood. "I can't keep doing this. He deserves to know the truth." That overheard fragment had been enough. David's mind, already primed by past trauma, had filled in the blanks with the worst possible scenarios. She was having an affair. She was marrying him for his money, modest as it was. She was using him as a backup plan while pursuing someone else. The possibilities multiplied in his head like a virus, each one more painful than the last. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, and he couldn't bring himself to simply ask her what was going on, because asking required vulnerability, and vulnerability had destroyed him before. So David Mitchell, in his infinite wisdom and profound brokenness, decided to engineer a test. He would fake a medical emergency. He would pretend to be critically ill. And he would watch from a hidden vantage point to see how Emma truly behaved when she thought he might die. Would she stay by his side? Would she call another man? Would she reveal her true colors when the pressure was at its peak? Looking back, David would spend years trying to understand how he'd convinced himself this was reasonable. How had a grown man, educated and supposedly rational, decided that staging his own medical crisis was a logical response to relationship anxiety? But trauma doesn't follow logic. Fear doesn't consult reason. And David Mitchell, for all his spreadsheets and careful planning, was a man operating from a wound that had never properly healed. He recruited his childhood friend Marcus, now a nurse at Portland General Hospital, into his scheme. Marcus had been reluctant, calling the plan manipulative and potentially illegal. But David had been desperate, and desperation can be persuasive. They'd worked out the details over 3 sleepless nights. David would fake a collapse during the wedding rehearsal. Marcus would ensure he was brought to the hospital where Marcus worked. A private room would be arranged with a connected observation space, a small staff break room with a window that looked directly into the patient room. David would be examined, declared critically unstable, and left under observation while Emma was allowed to sit with him. And David would watch everything from that hidden room, judging her, testing her, determining whether she was worthy of his broken trust. The rehearsal dinner was held at a small Italian restaurant that Emma's mother had chosen, a cozy place with red checkered tablecloths and the smell of garlic bread permanently baked into the walls. 24 people crowded around pushed-together tables, David's family, Emma's family, and a handful of close friends. Emma's younger sister was cracking jokes about marriage being a life sentence. David's mother was offering unsolicited advice about housekeeping. And Emma sat beside David, her hand resting on his knee under the table, occasionally squeezing it gently, a small gesture of connection that would haunt him later. She looked beautiful that night, in a simple blue dress, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes bright with what he would later recognize as exhaustion rather than joy. At one point, she'd leaned over and whispered, "I can't believe we're actually doing this. I have something amazing to tell you after the wedding. Something that's going to change everything." Those words should have reassured him. Instead, they'd felt like confirmation of his worst fears. Something that would change everything. Of course, she was going to call off the wedding. She was going to confess to an affair. She was going to destroy him, just like Jennifer had destroyed him 7 years ago. So when the moment came, when David stood to give a toast to Emma and their future together, he'd let his knees buckle. He'd let the wine glass slip from his fingers and shatter on the tile floor. He'd let his body collapse in a carefully controlled fall that looked dramatic but caused no real injury. The restaurant had erupted in chaos. Emma had screamed his name and dropped to her knees beside him. Her father had called 911, while her mother held Emma back from shaking David's supposedly unconscious body. And David, lying there with his eyes closed, listening to Emma's panicked breathing, had felt a sick mixture of guilt and vindication. This was it. The test had begun. Would she pass, or would she reveal herself to be just another liar, just another person who would betray him when the stakes were highest? The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. EMTs loaded David onto a stretcher, while Emma clutched at his hand, tears streaming down her face. He heard her voice breaking as she begged him to wake up, to squeeze her fingers, to give her any sign that he was okay. And through it all, David kept his eyes closed and his breathing shallow, committed to his terrible plan, convinced that this deception was justified, that the truth he'd uncover would be worth the pain he was inflicting. At Portland General, Marcus met the ambulance and smoothly directed David to the prearranged room. The performance continued. Doctors examined him with serious expressions that were only half fake. They genuinely couldn't find anything wrong with him, which added an uncomfortable layer of realism to the deception. Emma was kept in the waiting room for 2 hours, while David was stabilized and assessed. During that time, David sat in the hidden observation room, watching the empty patient bed through the window, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Marcus brought him coffee and a sandwich, neither of which he could stomach. Finally, around midnight, a doctor, another friend Marcus had reluctantly recruited into this scheme, emerged to speak with Emma. David watched on a small monitor connected to the hallway security camera as the doctor delivered his carefully rehearsed lines. David had experienced what appeared to be a neurological event. His condition was critical but stable. They were running tests, but the next 24 hours would be crucial. Emma could sit with him, but she needed to prepare herself for the possibility that he might not wake up. The doctor had delivered this fiction with appropriate gravitas, and David had watched Emma's face crumble. She was allowed into the room at 12:30 in the morning. David, now properly arranged in the hospital bed, with monitoring equipment attached to his chest, IV in his arm, and eyes closed, listened as Emma pulled a chair close to his bedside. For a long moment, she said nothing. He could hear her breathing, shaky and irregular. Then she took his hand, and he felt her tears dripping onto his skin. Emma Chen, the woman he was supposed to marry in less than 2 days, sat in that hospital room and cried. Not prettily, not quietly. She cried the way people cry when they think no one is watching, with heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. She cried for 47 minutes straight, and David watched from his hidden room, feeling the first uncomfortable stirrings of doubt about his plan. This didn't look like the reaction of a woman who was relieved to be free of an unwanted fiancé. This looked like genuine grief. But David had learned not to trust appearances. Jennifer had cried too, back when she'd sworn she loved only him. Tears could be manufactured. Emotion could be performed. He needed more evidence. He needed to see what Emma did when she thought she was truly alone, when she believed no one was watching, when the pressure was at its absolute peak. Around 2 in the morning, Emma finally stopped crying. She wiped her face with tissues from the box on the bedside table, blew her nose, and pulled out her phone. David leaned forward in the observation room, his heart racing. This was it. This was the moment that would reveal everything. Emma stared at her phone for almost 3 full minutes before dialing. When someone answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's me. I know it's late. I'm so sorry, but something's happened." David collapsed at the rehearsal. He's in the hospital, and they don't know if he's going to wake up. A pause. David couldn't hear the voice on the other end. "No, I haven't told anyone. I can't. Not now. Not like this. But if he doesn't make it, if he dies, I need you to know that I tried. I really tried to make this work." David felt ice spreading through his chest. There it was. Confirmation. She'd been talking to someone else. someone she'd been trying to hide, someone who mattered enough to call in the middle of the night from her dying fiancé's hospital room. He wanted to burst through the door, to confront her, to end this charade. But he forced himself to remain still, to see how far this would go, to collect every piece of evidence before revealing his hand. Emma continued talking, her voice gaining strength. "I need you to come tomorrow, to the hospital. I don't care what David's family thinks. I don't care about the questions. If he wakes up, I'm going to tell him everything, the whole truth. And if he doesn't, I need you here anyway, because I can't do this alone." She listened for a moment, then said, "Thank you. I love you. I'll see you tomorrow." And she hung up. David sat in the observation room, his hands shaking with rage and vindication. He'd been right. He'd been right all along. Emma was in love with someone else. She'd been planning to tell him the whole truth after the wedding, which obviously meant she was going to confess to an affair or call the marriage off. And now, thinking he was dying, she was summoning this mystery person to the hospital, probably to play the grieving widow, while secretly celebrating her freedom with her real love. Every terrible scenario David had imagined was unfolding exactly as he'd feared. He was devastated. He was furious. And underneath both of those emotions was a deeper, more painful feeling, the familiar sensation of being proven right about humanity's fundamental untrustworthiness, about the impossibility of genuine connection, about his own unworthiness of honest love. But then Emma did something David hadn't anticipated. After hanging up the phone, she turned back to his supposedly unconscious body, took his hand again, and began to talk. Not to anyone else, just to him. Speaking as if he could hear her, as if her words might somehow penetrate whatever medical condition was supposedly keeping him trapped. Emma Chen, thinking she was talking to an unresponsive body, began to tell David Mitchell the truth. And David Mitchell, hiding in the next room, began to understand the enormity of his mistake. "David, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need to say this now in case I never get another chance," Emma began, her voice steady despite the tears still on her cheeks. "I've been keeping something from you, something big, and I know it was wrong to hide it, but I was scared. I was so scared that if I told you, you'd see me differently. You'd treat me like I was fragile or broken. But if you're really leaving me, if I'm really going to lose you, then you deserve to know the truth, even if you can't hear it." She took a shaky breath. 3 months ago, I went to the doctor because I'd been having chest pains and feeling dizzy. I thought it was just stress from wedding planning. The doctor ran some tests. "David, they found something wrong with my heart. Not immediately life-threatening, but serious. A condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. My heart isn't pumping blood as efficiently as it should. It's treatable, manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, but it means I might not be able to have children, or if I do, pregnancy could be dangerous, maybe even fatal." David felt the floor drop out from under him. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't an affair or a deception. This was Emma facing a serious medical diagnosis, alone while planning their wedding. "I didn't tell you because I knew how much you wanted kids," Emma continued, her voice breaking. "You've talked about being a father since our third date. You've got names picked out. You've shown me houses with good school districts. And I couldn't bear to take that dream away from you. I thought maybe If we got married first, if you were already committed, it would hurt less when I finally told you. I know that was selfish. I know I should have been honest from the start. But David, I love you so much. I didn't want to lose you before I even had you. She was crying again now, but talking through the tears. The person I called, that was my cardiologist, Dr. Sarah Chen. No relation, despite the last name. She's been helping me manage this, adjusting my medications, preparing treatment plans. I asked her to come tomorrow because if you die, if I lose you, I don't think I can handle being alone while also dealing with this diagnosis. And if you wake up, I'm going to tell you everything because I can't keep lying to you. I can't marry you with this huge secret between us. Even if it means you leave me, even if you decide I'm not worth the complications, you deserve the truth. In the observation room, David had gone completely still. His carefully constructed test, his elaborate scheme to catch Emma in a betrayal, had instead caught him in a moment of devastating honesty from a woman who'd been suffering in silence to protect his feelings and his dreams. Emma wasn't hiding an affair. She wasn't planning to leave him. She was dealing with a serious health condition alone because she loved him too much to burden him with difficult choices before their wedding. The woman he'd been testing, the woman whose loyalty he'd questioned, had been trying to give him one perfect, uncomplicated wedding day before revealing a truth that might cost her everything she wanted. David felt sick. Not pretend sick. Actually, physically sick with shame and horror at what he'd done. He'd taken Emma's kindness, her sacrifice, her genuine love, and he'd twisted it into evidence of betrayal. He'd let his past trauma corrupt his ability to see present reality. He'd become the villain in his own story, and he hadn't even realized it until this moment. Emma stayed by David's bedside for the rest of that night. She didn't sleep. She didn't check her phone, except to decline calls from worried family members asking for updates. She just sat there, holding his hand, occasionally talking to him about their relationship, their memories, the future she'd hoped they'd have together. She told him about the day they met at the book club, how she'd thought he was pretentious when he'd argued that mystery novels were the most intellectually sophisticated genre of fiction. She told him about the moment she'd fallen in love with him, 3 months into their relationship, when he'd spent an entire Sunday helping her move her elderly neighbor's furniture after the woman's son had abandoned her. She told him about her fears for their marriage, not because she doubted him, but because she doubted herself, her ability to give him the life he deserved with her compromised health. And through it all, David listened from the next room, each word landing like a blow, each confession making his own deception more unbearable. Around 5 in the morning, Emma's phone rang. She checked it, declined the call, but David saw her face change as she read something on the screen. She stood abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the pre-dawn darkness over Portland. When she turned back, there were fresh tears on her face, but also something else, a kind of resigned determination. She walked back to David's bedside and leaned down, her lips close to his ear. "David, Dr. Chen just sent me my latest test results. My heart function has declined more than expected. She wants to start more aggressive treatment, possibly a pacemaker, if the medication doesn't work. I'm 35 years old, and I might need a pacemaker. I might never be able to carry our children. I might be a burden to you for the rest of whatever time I have." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And the terrible thing, the thing I hate myself for thinking, is that maybe it would be easier if you don't wake up. Maybe it would hurt less if I lose you now, when you still think I'm perfect, instead of later, when you've realized I'm broken." David almost broke character then. Almost leaped up from his fake unconsciousness to tell her she wasn't broken, that he was the one who was shattered beyond repair. But he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the weight of what he'd done, by the realization that his test had succeeded in revealing truth, just not the truth he'd expected. Emma wasn't the one who'd failed. He was. Emma straightened up and wiped her eyes. "But you're going to wake up," she said firmly, "because you're stubborn and you don't know how to quit anything, even when you should. And when you do, I'm going to tell you everything. About my heart, about my fears, about why I've been so distracted and secretive. And then you're going to make a choice. You're going to decide if loving me is worth all the complications I come with. And whatever you decide, I'll understand. I'll be heartbroken, literally and figuratively, but I'll understand." She kissed his forehead gently. "I love you, David Mitchell. Even if you never hear me say it again, I need you to know that I've loved you since that stupid book club argument, and I'll love you until my compromised heart finally gives out." Dr. Sarah Chen arrived at the hospital at 7 in the morning. David watched through the observation room window as a short, efficient-looking woman in her late 40s entered the room where Emma sat. The two women embraced, and Emma immediately broke down again, sobbing into the doctor's shoulder. Dr. Chen let her cry for a moment, then gently guided her to the chairs in the corner of the room, away from David's supposedly unconscious body. David couldn't hear their conversation from the observation room. The audio monitoring equipment Marcus had set up only covered the area immediately around the hospital bed. But he could see Emma's face, see the way she gestured helplessly, see the doctor's concerned, compassionate expression. After about 20 minutes, Dr. Chen stood and approached David's bedside. She checked his vitals on the monitors, completely professional, then glanced toward the observation window. For one heart-stopping moment, David thought she'd somehow figured out the deception. But she simply returned to Emma and spoke softly to her. Emma nodded, stood on shaky legs, and left the room with the doctor. Marcus appeared in the observation room moments later, his face grim. That was Emma's cardiologist. She's taking Emma to the cafeteria for breakfast and to discuss her latest test results in detail. "David, we need to end this. Now. This has gone too far." David couldn't speak. His throat felt like it was closing. Marcus sat down heavily in the chair David had occupied all night. "I've been monitoring everything. I heard what Emma told you about her heart condition, about why she's been secretive. David, you've made a terrible mistake. This woman loves you. She's been protecting you from a difficult truth, not betraying you, and you've been spying on her most vulnerable moments." David finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. I know, Marcus. I don't know what I was thinking. After Jennifer." Marcus cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Jennifer was 7 years ago. Emma is not Jennifer. You took your trauma and you weaponized it against an innocent person, a sick person who was trying to give you one perfect wedding day before burdening you with her reality. Do you understand how messed up that is? David understood. He understood completely. He also understood that he couldn't simply leap up from the hospital bed now and announce, "Surprise, I was faking it the whole time to test your loyalty." That would be unforgivable. Emma would leave him. She should leave him. He deserved to be left. Marcus was watching him with something between pity and disgust. "You have two choices," Marcus said quietly. "You can continue this charade. Let the doctors tell Emma that you're waking up, and then have a tearful reunion where she confesses everything and you pretend to hear it for the first time. That's the coward's way out. Or you can tell her the truth. Walk out there right now and confess what you've done. Face the consequences. Let her decide if you're worth forgiving." David knew which choice he should make. He also knew which choice he wanted to make. And the gap between those two things felt like a chasm he couldn't cross. He'd already proven himself to be manipulative and untrustworthy. Did he really want to compound those sins with cowardice? But telling Emma the truth meant losing her. It meant watching her face transform from love to betrayal. It meant confirming every doubt she'd expressed about her own worthiness. Because how could she not internalize his deception as a reflection of her own inadequacy? While David sat paralyzed by indecision in the observation room, something happened that would make the choice for him. Emma collapsed in the hospital cafeteria. Dr. Chen's urgent voice crackled over Marcus's radio. "We need a crash cart in the cafeteria now. Patient is a 35-year-old female with known cardiomyopathy, presenting with chest pain and loss of consciousness." Marcus ran. David, without thinking, ran after him, still wearing his hospital gown, trailing his disconnected IV line, no longer caring about maintaining his cover. By the time he reached the cafeteria, a crowd had gathered. EMTs were loading Emma onto a stretcher. Her eyes were closed. Her face was gray. Dr. Chen was shouting orders about medications and cardiac monitoring. And David realized, with a horror so profound it felt like drowning, that while he'd been staging his fake crisis, Emma had been experiencing a real one. The stress of his supposed illness, the sleepless night, the emotional devastation, all of it, had triggered a cardiac event in a woman whose heart was already compromised. He'd nearly killed her. Not with intent, but with his selfishness, his paranoia, his inability to simply trust the woman who loved him. David tried to follow the stretcher, but a security guard held him back, confused about why a supposedly critical patient was running through the hospital. Marcus intervened, pulling David aside while explaining to the guard that there had been a misunderstanding about David's condition. As soon as the guard moved away, Marcus grabbed David by the shoulders. "You need to be honest with her family," Marcus said urgently. "They're going to be here soon, and they're going to have questions. You can lie to Emma if you want, but her parents and her sister deserve to know that their daughter's fiancé staged a fake medical emergency that triggered a real one." David nodded mutely. He felt like he was moving through water, every action slow and difficult. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Emma had to be okay. She had to survive, so he could confess, so he could apologize, so he could spend the rest of his life making up for what he'd done, if she'd let him. But what if she didn't survive? What if the last words she'd spoken to him were whispered to a man she thought was dying, when in reality he'd been faking the whole thing? What if she died, believing he'd never heard her confession, never understood her sacrifice, Never knew how much she loved him? Emma was taken to the cardiac intensive care unit, the same wing where David's room was located, an irony so bitter he could taste it. Her family arrived within an hour. Her mother, small and fierce, immediately demanded to know where David was and whether he was awake. Her father, a quiet man with Emma's same gentle eyes, asked the doctors whether Emma's stress about David's condition could have triggered the cardiac event. And her sister, Rachel, 29, and far more direct than the rest of the family, looked at David, who had appeared in the waiting room, now wearing borrowed scrubs Marcus had found, and asked the question David had been dreading. "Why are you walking around if you were supposedly at death's door 6 hours ago?" David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, and for the first time in his adult life, chose honesty over self-preservation. "Because I was never actually sick. I faked the collapse at the rehearsal. I staged the whole thing to test Emma's loyalty. And now she's in intensive care because the stress of my fake illness triggered a real crisis in her already compromised heart." The waiting room went silent. Emma's mother stared at him, like he'd grown a second head. Her father's gentle expression hardened into something David had never seen before. And Rachel, wonderful, protective Rachel, hauled back and slapped him across the face so hard his ears rang. "You did what?" Rachel's voice was shaking with fury. "My sister has been dealing with a heart condition for months. She's been terrified about telling you because she thought you'd leave her. She's been pushing herself to make your wedding perfect, while secretly seeing cardiologists and taking medication and worrying that she might die before making it down the aisle. And you decided that the best response to your own insecurity was to fake a medical emergency? To manipulate her? To test her like she's some kind of emotional lab rat?" Emma's mother had started crying. Her father looked like he wanted to hit David too. And David stood there, taking it, knowing he deserved every word, every accusation, every ounce of their rage. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt pathetically inadequate. "I'm so sorry. I was paranoid. I have trust issues from a past relationship, and I let them control me. I thought Emma was hiding something terrible. I didn't know about her heart. I didn't know she was sick. If I had known, if you had known—" "What?" Rachel interrupted. "You wouldn't have tested her? You would have trusted her? You're only sorry because it turned out she wasn't actually betraying you. If she'd been hiding an affair instead of a medical diagnosis, you'd be feeling justified right now." She was right. David knew she was right. He would have felt vindicated if Emma's secret had been another man instead of a failing heart. He would have convinced himself that his test was necessary and appropriate. The fact that Emma's secret was sympathetic didn't make his actions less manipulative. It just made him lucky that the truth was better than his paranoid imagination. "Can I see her?" David asked quietly. "When she's stable, can I talk to her? I need to tell her myself. I need to explain and apologize, and let her decide if she ever wants to see me again." Emma's mother spoke for the first time since David's confession. "You will not go near my daughter. You will not upset her further. You will not use her medical crisis as an opportunity to ease your own guilt. You've done enough damage." Dr. Chen, who had been standing near the nurse's station, approached the group. "Emma is stable for now. We've given her medication to regulate her heartbeat, and we're monitoring her closely. But I need to be clear with all of you. This cardiac event was serious. Emma's heart function was already compromised. This additional stress has caused further damage. We may need to consider more aggressive interventions, possibly including a heart transplant, if her condition continues to deteriorate. The weight of those words, heart transplant, settled over the waiting room like a shroud. David felt his knees weaken. This was his fault. Emma's deteriorating condition, the potential need for a transplant, all of it traced back to his decision to stage a fake crisis that triggered a real one. He had potentially destroyed the heart of the woman he loved, both literally and figuratively, because he couldn't bring himself to simply ask her what she was hiding. The irony was suffocating. He'd tested Emma's love and proven his own inadequacy instead. Emma's father approached David, his face carefully controlled. "I want you to leave this hospital. Emma will need support during her recovery, and that support cannot come from someone who traumatized her into this condition. When she's ready, if she's ready, she can contact you. But right now, you need to go." David wanted to protest, wanted to demand the right to see Emma, to confess, to apologize. But he had no rights here. He'd forfeited them when he decided to manipulate the woman he claimed to love. So he nodded, turned, and walked toward the hospital exit, leaving behind the woman who'd loved him enough to hide a serious illness to protect his happiness. Marcus found him in the parking lot, sitting on the curb, still wearing the borrowed scrubs. "Where are you going to go?" Marcus asked. David shrugged. "Home, I guess. To cancel a wedding that should have been in 24 hours. To figure out how to explain to 100 guests that I'm a manipulative coward who sent his fiancée into cardiac arrest." Marcus sat down beside him. "For what it's worth, I tried to talk you out of this. Multiple times." It wasn't worth much, but David appreciated the attempt at solidarity anyway. They sat in silence for a few minutes before Marcus spoke again. "Emma asked for you. Before they sedated her, she woke up briefly and asked if you were okay, if you'd woken up from your supposed crisis. Dr. Chen didn't know what to tell her." Of course Emma had asked about him, even while experiencing cardiac arrest, even while her compromised heart was failing. She'd been worried about him, because that's who Emma Chen was. She was the kind of person who protected others, even when it cost her everything. And David Mitchell was the kind of person who exploited that goodness to feed his own paranoia. 3 days passed. David existed in a fugue state, moving through his apartment like a ghost. He'd sent an email to the wedding guests, explaining that due to medical emergencies on both sides, the wedding was postponed indefinitely. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have the energy to craft a proper lie, and he couldn't bring himself to tell the truth. Emma's sister Rachel called once, her voice cold and professional, to inform him that Emma had been moved out of intensive care and into a regular cardiac unit. She was stable. She was awake, and she knew everything. "Wait, what do you mean she knows everything?" David asked, his heart pounding. "Dr. Chen told her what happened, that you'd faked your collapse, that you'd been watching her from another room, that your deception triggered her cardiac event. Emma knows all of it, David, and she wants to see you." This was it. The moment David had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. The chance to face Emma, to apologize directly, to accept whatever judgment she delivered. But also the moment where he'd have to watch love turn to betrayal in the eyes of someone who'd given him everything. "When?" he asked. Now, if you can get here. Room 417. Her parents aren't here right now. You have maybe an hour before they come back. And David, if you hurt her again, in any way, I will destroy you. I will make it my life's mission to ensure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you are. Do you understand? He understood. David drove to Portland General in a daze. He parked in the same parking garage where he'd sat on the curb 3 days earlier. He took the elevator to the 4th floor. He found room 417, and he stood outside Emma's door for 5 full minutes, trying to find the courage to knock. Emma saved him the trouble. You can come in, David. I can see your shadow under the door. Her voice was weak but clear. David pushed the door open and stepped inside. Emma was sitting up in bed, propped on pillows, wearing a hospital gown and connected to various monitors. She looked exhausted. She looked fragile. She also looked absolutely furious. Hi, David said inadequately. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Hi, you look good for someone who was supposedly dying 3 days ago. The sarcasm in her voice was so unlike her that David actually flinched. Emma, She held up a hand to stop him. No, I'm going to talk first. You're going to listen. Then you can say whatever you need to say. And then you're going to leave and let me decide if I ever want to see you again. Do we understand each other? David nodded and sat in the visitor's chair, the same chair Emma had occupied during her vigil by his fake sickbed. Emma took a breath, winced slightly, probably from pain, and began. I have spent the last 3 days trying to understand why you did what you did. I've run through every possible explanation. You don't trust me. You have trauma from your ex. You're secretly a sociopath who enjoys manipulating people. But none of those explanations make sense because the David I knew, the David I agreed to marry, wasn't capable of this level of deception. So, I've come to a different conclusion. The David I knew doesn't exist. Or maybe he existed, but he was always conditional. He was only kind when I met his standards. He only loved me when I behaved in ways that confirmed his worldview. The moment I deviated from his expectations, the moment I had private phone calls and closed my laptop and kept a secret, he decided I was the enemy. And instead of talking to me, instead of trusting me, instead of treating me like a partner, he staged an elaborate test to confirm his worst assumptions. She paused, tears gathering in her eyes. Do you know what that does to a person, David? To realize that the man you love has been watching you, judging you, testing you. To understand that your most vulnerable moments, your tears, your confessions, your private grief, were all being monitored by someone who was supposed to protect you. David wanted to speak, to defend himself, to explain, but he'd promised to listen, and he owed Emma that much at least. She continued, her voice growing stronger despite the tears. I told you things I've never told anyone, about my fear of dying, about thinking it might be easier if you died so I wouldn't have to face your rejection. I said those things because I thought I was talking to an unconscious man who might never wake up. I said them because I needed to confess, to unburden myself before it was too late. And you were there the whole time, listening, judging, probably congratulating yourself on your clever plan to catch me in whatever betrayal you'd imagined. She wiped her eyes roughly. And the truly cruel part, the thing I can't forgive, is that your test worked. It revealed the truth, just not about me, It revealed that you don't trust me, that you never trusted me, that somewhere deep inside, you were always waiting for me to betray you because that's what Jennifer did. I was never Emma to you. I was always just Jennifer's replacement, a placeholder you were constantly evaluating to see if I'd fail the same way she did. The accuracy of her assessment hit David like a physical blow. She was right. He'd never fully separated Emma from his past trauma. He'd been waiting for her to hurt him, expecting it, almost hoping for it so he could confirm his belief that everyone eventually betrays everyone else. I'm sorry. The words felt hollow, but David forced them out anyway. You're right about everything. I never gave you the benefit of the doubt. I took your kindness and your love, and I twisted them into evidence of deception because that felt safer than trusting you. I let my past control my present, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to make up for. You should hate me. You should never want to see me again, and I'll understand if that's what you decide. Emma laughed, a bitter sound. Oh, David, I don't hate you. I wish I did. Hate would be cleaner, simpler, but I don't hate you. I'm heartbroken. I'm furious. I'm devastated. But underneath all of that, I still love you, and that makes everything so much worse. David looked up, surprised. You still love me? After what I did? Emma shook her head slowly. Love doesn't turn off like a switch just because someone hurts you. I'm sure you know that from your experience with Jennifer. You probably loved her for a long time after she betrayed you. That's the terrible thing about loving someone. It persists, even when it shouldn't, even when the person doesn't deserve it anymore. She leaned back against her pillows, suddenly looking exhausted. But love isn't enough, is it? Love without trust is just prolonged suffering. And David, I can never trust you again. Even if I wanted to, even if I could forgive what you did, I'd always be wondering, is he testing me right now? Is this conversation real? Or is he evaluating my responses? Is his love genuine or conditional? I'd be living in a constant state of performance anxiety, trying to prove my worthiness to someone who's already decided I'm guilty until proven innocent. The finality in her voice made David's chest ache. This was it. The relationship was over. Not because Emma had failed his test, but because he'd failed hers. A test he hadn't even known he was taking. A test of basic human decency, of treating your partner with respect and trust, of choosing communication over manipulation. I have a heart condition, Emma continued, her voice softer now. I might need a transplant. I might die young. I might never be able to give you the children you want. And I was willing to risk rejection by telling you all of that because I thought you deserved the truth. But you couldn't do the same for me. You couldn't risk the vulnerability of simply asking what I was hiding. You had to maintain control, had to protect yourself from possible pain, even if it meant inflicting certain pain on me. She looked directly at him, her eyes red but clear. So here's my answer to your test, David. Yes, I loved you enough to sit by what I thought was your deathbed. Yes, I loved you enough to confess my deepest fears and vulnerabilities. Yes, I loved you enough to call my doctor in the middle of the night because I couldn't face losing you alone. I passed your test with perfect marks, but you failed mine. You failed to be honest. You failed to trust. You failed to treat me like a human being instead of a potential threat. And that failure is unforgivable. David sat in the chair, absorbing Emma's words, accepting his judgment. She was right. About everything. He'd failed in every way that mattered. But there was one thing he needed to tell her, one piece of truth he owed her before he walked out of her life forever. "You should know," David said quietly, "that when I heard your confession about your heart condition, when I realized what you'd been hiding, and why, I wanted to stop the whole thing immediately. I wanted to run into that room and hold you and tell you that your illness didn't matter, that I loved you regardless. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd already gone too far. I'd already proven myself to be manipulative and untrustworthy. Coming clean at that moment would have just been another manipulation, another way of controlling the narrative to make myself look better." He met her eyes. "So I let you continue thinking I was unconscious. I let you confess your fears to someone you thought couldn't hear you. And then when you had your cardiac event, I realized I'd done exactly what I was afraid you'd do. I'd betrayed you. I'd broken your trust. I'd hurt you so badly that your heart, your literal heart, couldn't take the strain. Everything I accused you of, every terrible thing I imagined you might do, I'd already done to you." Emma's expression softened slightly, though the pain in her eyes remained. "And what do you want from me now, David? Absolution? Permission to forgive yourself? A dramatic reunion where we overcome this obstacle and live happily ever after?" David shook his head. "No. I want you to know that I understand what I did. I want you to know that you deserved better. And I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on the broken parts of myself that led to this, not because I think it'll win you back, but because I never want to hurt anyone this way again." He stood slowly. "I'm going to leave now, and I'm not going to contact you again unless you reach out first. Your recovery is the most important thing, not my guilt, not my need for forgiveness. Just you, getting better, moving on, finding someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved." He moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Emma, the person you loved wasn't completely fake. The David exists. He's just buried under a lot of trauma and fear. Maybe someday I'll find him again. But by then, you'll have long since moved on, and you'll be living the life you were meant to have with someone who doesn't test you before trusting you." David walked out of room 417. He took the elevator to the ground floor. He walked through the lobby where, just 4 days earlier, EMTs had rushed him in on a stretcher for his staged emergency. And he kept walking, out into the parking lot, into his car, back to his empty apartment where a wedding invitation still sat on the table, announcing a celebration that would never happen. 3 months later, Emma had her surgery. Not a heart transplant, thankfully, but a pacemaker and a procedure to repair some of the damage from her cardiac event. David knew this because Rachel posted about it on social media, along with a photo of Emma smiling weakly from a hospital bed, surrounded by family. He'd been blocked from Emma's accounts, but Rachel's remained public, perhaps intentionally so he could see that Emma was surviving without him. David had started therapy. Twice a week, he sat in a small office and talked about Jennifer's betrayal, about his trust issues, about his need for control, about the ways trauma had warped his ability to form healthy relationships. It was painful, it was humbling, but it was necessary. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Emma, but he could ensure he never did it to anyone else. 1 year after the test that destroyed everything, David received a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual physical letter with Emma's handwriting on the envelope. He stared at it for 3 days before opening it, terrified of what it might contain. When he finally worked up the courage to read it, he found something he didn't expect. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. Emma wrote that she'd been in therapy too, that she'd worked through her anger and her hurt, that she'd come to understand how broken someone has to be to do what David did. She wrote that she was dating someone new, a guy named Michael who taught math at her school, someone who'd supported her through her recovery without making it about himself. She wrote that she was happy, or getting there anyway. And she wrote that she hoped David was healing too, that he was learning to trust, that he was building a life not defined by his past traumas. The letter ended with a paragraph that David would read 100 times over the following months. I've learned that love, real love, isn't about grand gestures or dramatic tests. It's about showing up every day and choosing to trust even when it's scary. It's about being vulnerable even when you might get hurt. It's about treating your partner like a partner, not like an opponent or a puzzle to solve. You taught me that lesson, David, though probably not in the way you intended. And I hope someday you learn it too. Not for my sake, but for yours, and for whoever you love next. Because you're capable of love. I saw it in you. It was just buried under so much fear that it couldn't breathe. Maybe now, with time and work, you'll excavate it, and maybe you'll give someone else the gift of your trust without making them earn it first. David kept that letter in his nightstand drawer. On hard days, when the shame of what he'd done threatened to overwhelm him, he'd read it and remember that growth was possible, that change was achievable, that one terrible decision didn't have to define the rest of his life. He never reached out to Emma again. That chapter was closed permanently, and rightfully so. But he carried her words with him as he slowly, painfully rebuilt himself into someone who could love without suspicion, who could trust without verification, who could be vulnerable without needing to maintain control. 2 years after the test, David met someone new. Her name was Grace, and she was a veterinarian with a laugh that sounded like sunshine. They met at a coffee shop when she asked to share his table during the lunch rush. They talked for an hour about nothing important, and when she gave him her number, David felt the familiar urge to test her, to verify that her interest was genuine, to protect himself from potential hurt. But he didn't. Instead, he chose trust. It felt like jumping off a cliff. It felt terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And when Grace texted him later that evening with a simple, "I had fun today, let's do it again," David replied honestly, "Me too, I'd like that." No games, no tests, just two people taking a chance on each other. The relationship developed slowly. David was upfront about his past, about his mistakes, about the work he'd done to address his trust issues. Grace appreciated his honesty and shared her own baggage, her fear of commitment stemming from her parents' bitter divorce, her tendency to run when relationships got too serious. They built something real together, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, act of trust by act of trust. And when Grace started taking phone calls in another room, when she became distracted and secretive, David felt the old paranoia stirring. But instead of staging a test, instead of creating elaborate schemes to uncover her secrets, he did something revolutionary. He asked her directly, "Grace, you've been acting different lately. More secretive. I'm trying not to jump to conclusions, but I need to know if something's wrong or if there's something you need to tell me." Grace had looked at him with surprise, then relief. "I've been planning a surprise party for your 40th birthday. It's been hell trying to coordinate everything without you figuring it out. I'm so glad you just asked, instead of assuming the worst. Thank you for trusting me enough to communicate." Such a simple thing. Communication, trust, basic human decency. But for David, it was a hard-won victory. Evidence that he could break the cycle, that he could choose differently than he had with Emma. The party was lovely. Friends from work, Marcus, who'd remained loyal despite everything, even Grace's family, who'd welcomed David with open arms. As he stood in his apartment, surrounded by people who cared about him, David thought about Emma. He hoped she was happy. He hoped Michael was treating her the way she deserved. He hoped her heart, both literal and metaphorical, had healed from the damage he'd caused. And he said a silent thank you to her for not letting him off the hook, for holding him accountable, for forcing him to face the worst parts of himself, so he could do the work necessary to change. Some relationships end in gentle fade-outs, mutual recognition that things aren't working. Some end in explosive fights and dramatic confrontations. And some end in the quiet, devastating revelation that you've failed a test you didn't know you were taking, that you've hurt someone who loved you, that you've become the very thing you feared. David's relationship with Emma ended that way. And from those ashes, slowly, painfully, he'd built something better. Not a redemption, exactly. Some things can't be redeemed. But growth, progress, a commitment to being the kind of person who deserves trust instead of demanding it, who gives love freely instead of conditionally, who faces his fears through communication instead of manipulation. The test that David Mitchell staged to catch his fiancée in a betrayal ended up revealing the only betrayal that mattered, his own. Emma passed his test with perfect marks. She stayed by his bedside. She confessed her vulnerabilities. She called for support from her doctor, not from a secret lover. She proved her love in every way a person possibly could. And David failed her. He failed to trust. He failed to communicate. He failed to treat her like a partner, instead of a suspect. The story doesn't end with them reuniting. Some damage can't be repaired. Some trust, once broken, can't be rebuilt. But it ends with both of them moving forward, carrying the lessons from their relationship into new ones, building better lives from the rubble of what they'd lost. Because that's what healing looks like. Not erasing the past, not pretending mistakes didn't happen, but learning from them, growing beyond them, and choosing differently the next time you're faced with fear, doubt, and the terrible temptation to test someone's love instead of trusting it. David learned that lesson too late to save his relationship with Emma, but maybe not too late to save himself. And maybe, just maybe, not too late to save whoever comes next from the pain of loving someone who can't quite believe he's worthy of being loved in return. My mom said, "I can't reach 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong." What would you have done in David's position? Would you have tested your partner's loyalty, or would you have chosen trust? Let us know in the comments. And if you stayed till the end, thank you for being here. Your support means everything.